questions. All right, so welcome to a restart of our Get Growing webinar series. Today's topic is managing vegetable garden pests. This is one that comprises a lot of different presentations I've given previously, but it also includes a lot of newer topics. These are topics related to mammals and birds and other issues that we get a lot of questions about at our Master Gardener hotline desk, as well as just I've gotten previously through some of our Master Gardener trainings. A lot of times we are able to really tell you information when it comes to tomato pests and squash pests, but when it comes to some of those other pests that we deal with in the garden, sometimes we don't always have enough information or answers with that. So what I've tried to do today is to certainly zero in on some of these very popular topics, if you will, when it comes to managing vegetable garden pests. My name is McCarty. I'm a local foods and small farms educator, and I'll share a little bit more about myself on the next slide. A couple of things just to mention, while we will be talking about mammals and wildlife, I want to share that I am not a wildlife biologist, so I can't really tell you too much about some of the interactions that may be occurring with wildlife as far as their populations and how they go about. I'm coming from it as approaching more of what could you do to keep them from your vegetable plants? What would be some best practices? The other thing to mention here is, as I'm sure a lot of you have probably figured out as you have Googled a question related to, say, how to keep deer from eating your strawberries, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence out there. And what I've really tried to do with today's presentation is to really give you more research-based information and recommendations. And also recognize too that these are sometimes recommendations. Everyone's backyard is just a little bit different, and the way that our backyards are set up is very different as well. And so there can just be some of these very intricate things happening that may keep some of these recommendations from being really as accurate and addressing your problem as they could. That being said, I hope you get some great information out of today when it comes to potential vegetable garden pests you might be dealing with this summer or already dealing with this season. So as shared with you, I am a local foods and small farms educator. I'm up in Daviess-Stephenson-Winnebago counties. This is in northern Illinois. All three of my counties touch the Wisconsin state line. Most of my programming area tends to be in soil and soil management. I work with commercial and non-commercial fruits and vegetable production, which means really working with homeowners, backyard growers, as well as those selling at farmers markets and orchards. I do a lot of work in insect and disease management, and for the last 4 years, I've been working in apple tree pruning classes, teaching those to homeowners and other growers when it comes to getting your trees back in shape. I am in planting zone 5B, and I know a number of folks from around the state are joining our call. This presentation will probably not be too impactful when it comes to my planting zone, but just recognize that I speak from a place where typically the last spring frost is around mid-May. Most of our homeowners and growers who are going to be growing tomatoes in the field right now are just starting to put out their tomatoes, which kind of gives you an idea of where our growing season is. Today's plan is going to get into general management of vegetable insect pests. What are some things to really kind of think about when it comes to kind of some best practices, and what are some other issues you might run into when it comes to them. We'll zero in on insects, such as those in the cole family, so cabbage, broccoli, kale. I'll talk about some of the insect pests in the squash family, as well as that nightshade family of tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, also known as solanaceous in this category. I've also included a number of other insects that we get questions about: Japanese beetles, slugs, grasshoppers, earwigs, a number of these somewhat generalist insects that might go for a number of different vegetables that you might be growing. We'll talk a lot about mammals today and kind of those individual mammals and what their actions are, what they do as far as damage, what are some strategies that you could be doing in that backyard setting. I'll mention birds a little bit briefly. We see it more in fruit production, and yet you may have some overlap with your vegetables as well, and then mention weeds. As you can kind of see with this list, there's a lot to cover today. So it is a lot of information all at once, I recognize, but I come from a place of really wanting you to have this information when it comes to presenting. Recognize when it comes to pest management, I think it's very important to know your vegetable growing area. And it may be that you're growing in a new area and you're just starting to figure out what the pest pressure may be. I've just recently purchased a house, and so I'm growing in a new area for me that I haven't had a full, complete growing season with. And I'm just starting to figure out what some of the mammal damage may be from where I'm growing and what some of the pest pressure of insects may be as well. However, you could be growing in an area that you've grown for years and you already kind of have an idea of what to expect when you put a plant out. It's also very important to really think about your crop vulnerabilities. For some of these specific crops, you may find that they have 3 or 4 insect pests that will typically go after them. Or you may find that there's a mammal that really particularly likes a certain vegetable. And so already placing it in your garden is going to have an exposed to potential damage. It's very important to have a lot of your damage properly ID'd. And also that can give you a great idea of what's causing the damage and the ability to then go from there. We'll talk more about this and show some photos of what some of this damage can look like. I think it's also crucial from a vegetable point of view to rely heavily on growing area modification. This could be that you are growing some of your vegetables closer to your home. It could be you're relying on raised beds. It could be that you put your vegetables out and you already put kind of a barrier or a cover on them. It could be that maybe you're removing parts of your backyard growing area because there's potential for mammals, birds, and other populations to hang out and move in. It could also mean that you're removing your weeds that are nearby and any grasses that would allow for these pest populations to build up. So that's what we mean there. There's a lot of ways that you could be doing some crop growing modifications, some of which might be really easy, some of which may not be easy whatsoever. A lot of times it's also important if you have found a crop that has damaged to look for certain signs. Or maybe you have a crop that you know there's no damage yet, and yet when you turn over a leaf, maybe you see egg sacs, such as the Colorado potato beetle, which you see here. While you may not see damage just yet, if you turned over the leaf, you would actually see all of these orange egg sacs, which need to be destroyed and removed, or else you would have a greater population of these Colorado potato beetles move in. You may also find droppings. You may also find initial damage. The other thing to look for is maybe your ornamental plants are already starting to show damage. And that could then tell you that you may have a problem just yet. Some of our plants have already sustained rabbit damage, and I am crucially aware of that when it comes to some of my other vegetables that I might be planting out, that, okay, I have a rabbit population already, I know that. And so maybe I need to figure out how to modify my vegetable growing area. Many of our vegetable pests may have a crop that they really like. It could be that it is something that they just love, they defoliate, they have a liking to it, versus another crop that they just cannot stand and they're not going to eat. We see some things such as ground squirrels or chipmunks that may be more attracted to tomatoes that are ripening and strawberries that are ripening versus maybe some of those other vegetables out there. You may find through some of your observations in the backyard that Japanese beetles are congregating all over your grape leaves and compared to maybe some of your other plants that are out there. You may also find too that they might have ignored it at an early stage and now the plant has grown, it's developed something that they really like. Or they may just love everything. Sometimes that's what you run into when it comes to some of these pests that you deal with. From a perspective of disease issues, damage can sometimes lead to disease. So the crop is now vulnerable, it's now open to disease pressure if this crop has been damaged from it. look towards creating areas that keep a population from increasing. And that could be that you're doing more active mowing. You maybe are removing brush piles that could allow for this population to build up. You could be making sure that any cracks or crevices underneath parts of your house are sealed up properly. Currently, we have an area that we know a ground squirrel is living in as I watch it move back and forth underneath our deck opening. So I need to address that before it becomes a problem. Know that when it comes to pest management, you're using multiple strategies and you're troubleshooting. It's not just one silver bullet. It's not just one easy solution to address a vegetable pest issue. It's multiple solutions, and it is kind of throwing everything at it sometimes, like as a kitchen sink, if you will. And know that some years can be pretty good and fine and no pest issues versus ones that won't be. I always share with folks that every backyard is also different. And that can be that your mammal populations are different, the way that your ornamentals, your trees, your shrubs are set up, the way that even the existing population of mammals may be an issue as well too. Depending on where you're growing and where you're at, you may have a lot of control over your backyard and your front yard when it comes to mammal population and addressing pest management. Could be you have a number of acres that sometimes we see in Joe Davis County, and you're able to really control that growing area, versus myself, where we live kind of in a 1950s style community, and so the backyards are touching every backyard. So while I could control my population in my backyard, my neighbors, both on either side and behind me, may have a population that could increase and visit my yard. So it might be a little hard to do that. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence out there, suggestions that may make a lot of sense for you and maybe you have had good success with, but may not work well for you. It could be that a solution as far as collecting hair clippings to address and put around your garden to address a problem might not work really well. For you, it may work well for someone else. Some folks may have suggested you put blood meal around certain parts of your garden and that they felt like worked for them, and maybe it doesn't work for you. There's always going to be more anecdotal evidence out there, and we cannot always really suggest that when it comes to kind of our guiding principles in our extension system. What I've tried to do is really look and zero in on where some of the research is and what it shows. But recognize too, every year is different, every season can be a bit different. You may find that it's best just to remove the crop and move on, or sacrifice a crop and move on from it. But that can sometimes be expected. And you may reach a state of toleration. We don't like to think about that, but you may find that it is just time to move on from that crop and growing that crop, especially if you find that the pest pressure is just too much and you've tried to kind of do everything on your checklist when it comes to it. So let's get into some basics of what some of the damage can look like and kind of what we see kind of within each of these categories. For insect damage, I think this is one where most people are going to be pretty comfortable IDing. You'll see very small parts of the plant have chewing, and that may be coming from our worms, our Lepidopteran species, where they're just kind of chewing on parts of the leaf tissue. We see this a lot with cabbage plants, for instance, where we see lots of chewing damage, or from flea beetles on eggplant that are doing a lot of chewing. One of the ones that you may not see the actual insect would be the piercing sucking mouth part. The one you see here is a brown marmorated stink bug. And so you can actually see just little dots would be on the outside flesh of the tomato as it's ripening. And that would be damage that when you cut into it, you would actually have some blemishes. It's still edible, it's just not that appearance that you're really after here. You'll also find leaf mining, kind of cutting, removing of some of those leaves just as they're beginning to germinate. You may find some root feeding, although that may be another symptom of the plant that you may not see too well. And of course, stem feeding, sometimes even just removal of the whole stems by some of our insects. Many of them can be dictated by environmental and life cycles. So it could be that depending on the seasonality, whether we've had a very wet spring, whether we had a very dry spring, colderish winter, if you will, as well as just when they expect to reproduce. Sometimes these insect flushes will come in mid to late summer versus maybe coming in, say, the 1st of June or mid-June. It can very much depend on that. So you may find that, okay, if I could just get through a couple weeks' time, I could be okay when it actually comes to managing and dealing with these insect pressures. They tend to like one particular vegetable crop over another. When we talk about tomato insects, we tend to talk about, 3 or 4 that are the main issues. When it comes to, cabbage, cole plants, we usually talk about a number of cabbage worms, the main problem there. So they may find like a particular one over another. If you're looking to add to your library, there's a very good resource, Garden Insects of North America by Whitney Cranshaw. It's a very beautiful, nice book. What I like about this is that each insect is profiled, and it includes usually the droppings, the nymph stage or the very young stage of the insect, as well as the adult form and what some of the damage and solutions can be. It's a very good book, would highly recommend adding to your library. It's important too when it comes to the insect to really match management practices with the crop and the potential insect. There are going to be certain things that may make a lot of sense and some that do not make much sense whatsoever. Because so many of our vegetables will need some sort of pollination, it may be very hard to put a barrier in place. And you may find that the solution or the recommendation is actually hand picking or crop rotation or just something out there. So there's not always going to be some general guidance when it comes to it. The photo you see here is row cover. You're going to hear me talk a lot about row cover today. You'll also hear me talk a lot about floating row cover, and they are the same thing. What this row cover allows for is for light penetration, water penetration, and it's a very lightweight sheer material, almost like cheesecloth, if you will, yet it's designed for growing in more of a vegetable fruit growing area because it still allows for light and water to be penetrated through. It doesn't tend to be recommended too much for mammals, for like rabbits or ground squirrels or so forth, although you may find some success with it. But you're going to hear me talk a lot about this today as an exclusion barrier, because that's going to be sometimes the best recommendation we can share when it comes to vegetable insect control, is to use some form of row cover. This can be especially easy if it's a plant that will not require pollination, such as cabbage, kale, and broccoli. It may be a little bit more complicated to use row cover for those plants that require pollination, such as squash, tomatoes, and peppers, because it's keeping insects out, including those beneficial pollinators that we want. Some strategies can include traps. We'll go into some details on what some of them can look like today too. Repellents may work okay, and that's why you see an asterisk here. We'll talk about some of the companion plants out there and some of the ones that have been research-based and we kind of know can work. Crop rotation can sometimes work, but we don't see it work too well. The main crop rotation tends to be cholera potato beetles, where you might be rotating very far away from the previous year's crop. Sacrificial crops, trap cropping, we'll mention some today. Insecticides are available, some of which may require being placed on the actual insect itself instead of being digested by the insect. A lot of times it's hand removal and sometimes it's leaf removal. I'll go into more detail on these strategies, but these are just kind of your basic kind of, okay, what are the tools out there when it comes to insect control? Mammal damage tends to be that large parts of the plant are really chewed off. It could be that they're just kind of chewed back, ripped apart. It could be that the leaves are nibbled or they're actually cut all the way down to the stem. You will usually find new growth is uniformly nibbled off when it comes to mammal damage. Plants may also be eaten to the ground. We sometimes see that pretty regularly when it comes to deer and how they eat. Fruits may be damaged. They may even be entirely removed. Deer, ground squirrels, chipmunks, some of them tend to gravitate a little bit more towards some of the fruit as it is growing and as it is maturing. A lot of times other plants are more eaten to the ground, we see with rabbits and others. The rabbit damage is what you see here in this photo. It's a little more uniform than kind of we expect, and yet based on just kind of the damage and what this resource from University of Massachusetts shares, this was kind of the rabbit damage. Yet again, I'll show you more photos as we go along today. A lot of times the remediation for mammal damage is to think about site selection and to then kind of think about remediation. This could be that you are removing a plant that clearly they love, or removing a plant that you just cannot have much success with and kind of walking away from. But it can also be site selection, being very mindful of where your vegetable garden is located or where your vegetable plants are located. Some of these strategies will rely heavily on exclusion, keeping in some kind of netting, some sort of fencing, some sort of thing that could keep them from actually getting to where your crops are growing. Another strategy is growing area maintenance, making sure that areas are not as weedy or not as heavily overgrown when it comes to places where some of the mammal populations could hide. There are repellents, there are scare tactics, there are others, but they may not work well for you. They may work for just a period of time. They may just never work to begin with. Some of these repellents may also not be utilized or recommended to use in vegetable production either. So it could be that you are actually placing a repellent, such as some of those putrid egg solutions, on a plant nearby. So it isn't actually going directly on that vegetable. A barrier tends to be the most effective when it comes to keeping mammal damage away. In bird damage in the vegetable garden, there's potentially going to be removal of direct seeds. So that may be something that you run into, is that you have planted all of these seeds and maybe they just weren't buried at the right depth that they need to be, or maybe you got a number of inches of rain over the weekend and now these seeds are exposed, and that could be where the damage is occurring, and that's where the removal might be. We tend to see more commonly damage on fruits, your smaller fruits such as your blackberries, your raspberries, and your strawberries, but you may see some bird damage on lettuce, peppers, tomatoes, even sweet corn. Sweet corn is pretty common, especially from bird feeding. And you see an image of what this looks like from Purdue, where, just based on the appearance of the corn area itself, the husk leaves are shredded, they're damaged. There's just lots of missing kernels from the actual cob of the plant. There is going to be bird netting as a good strategy. Sometimes the garden location can also be crucial. So making sure you're placing a garden in an area where the bird population would not just roost and just wait for you to walk away, but also recognizing too, that depending on what you're growing, that could be the thing that's kind of aligning it. You may also find that the bird feeder location that you have in your home could be attracting more of that bird population, that while it's not a problem right now, it could become a problem in the short term, in the season. And this could be that you're removing that bird feeder, you're isolating other parts of your growing area, or you're just not using it that season. So to get into some basics of these strategies, and then we'll get into more detail when we profile more of these pest pressure. Exclusion. This will be a recommendation that we typically will recommend for really a lot of our vegetable pests. It tends to be more effective if it's in place before crops are planted or ripening. So as you're getting your garden area growing and set up for the season, you may find better success actually placing your crop in place, or rather your exclusion in place, before the pest pressure shows up. It could be something, for insects and birds. This could be that floating row cover, as you saw previously. It could also be that bird netting, which may have some good success when it comes to kind of addressing some of those insects, or rather those crop issues. This one, especially if it's a row cover, would be good for crops that will not need pollinated or eventually need pollination. You could plant your squash this week, for instance, put your row cover covering it, and then once it begins to flower, you could remove that row cover, and kind of then maybe that got you through a couple of weeks of not dealing with as much cucumber beetle damage. Bird netting could then be in place for the entire season due to the ability that it still allows for good air, water, as well as light penetration to happen. For a lot of our mammal populations, this is going to be fence and chicken wire. You're going to see that recommendation in most guides when it comes to controlling them. And the barrier and the actual width of the opening will depend highly on what that mammal is, as same as the height as well. That will be another kind of crucial step when it comes to putting them in place. So with something like row cover, chicken wire, netting, or even some kind of maybe a plastic apparatus that creates a barrier between your plants and likewise. These tend to be fairly cost effective. You know, I've had a floating row cover now for 5 years. I use the same one on a seasonal basis when it comes to some of the crops that I'm growing. You may find that, you know, chicken wire and some of those other nettings can also be pretty cost effective too. It may not take as much effort to implement. You may find that you may still have to kind of play around with it when it comes to actually putting these in place. You will find potentially that this could be pretty easy to do, and removal could occur during the season if need be. The only drawback here, especially with some of the recommendations for chicken wire and some of the other ones, is that many of them need to be buried at a depth below the soil surface, especially for rabbits and voles and some of those other ones. You will find that that needs to go down at least sometimes 4 to 6 inches. And it also needs to be angled a certain way to keep them from digging into your garden area. So it may not always make the most sense with that. You could also combine these with raised beds, with low tunnels. You're going to find a lot of DIY options out there when it comes to kind of these exclusions. And I combine them all because they tend to be fairly cost effective and may or may not be removed that season. For your fencing, this could also be combined with other exclusion practices. As much as this fence could be in place to address something like mammal control, you still might want to come through and have an additional netting or an additional fencing put in place that could address if a mammal is able to get into this fence. It can be utilized in the raised bed situations. There can also be a lot of do-it-yourself designs out there. But the issue, especially as we think about deer fencing and some of the other ones, is that they can be pretty expensive and they need to be a really strong height in order to be put into place, because most are designed to really stay in place that season. You can see this fence even. As much as this works okay, I still think there's many ways for additional mammals to get into this fence. I don't think it's going to be the easiest address the needs of pest pressure as well as it could. And I think that's what you're going to find is that when it comes to excluding in vegetable pest management, one may work well for one, while another one has to be set up or used for the other. So it could be that, yes, I have a fence in place for my vegetable garden, but I also am using row cover for my insects because they are obviously still going to get in, even though this is a very tall fence. We get a lot of questions in our extension office about repellents. And in thinking about repellents, think about, you know, some kind of crop that might be grown to repel the insect or a pest away based on the smell it's exuding. Or it could be something that has just something they don't tend to like. For companion plants for insects that have had some data behind them to show that these can work for insect control, this includes thyme, nasturtium, onion for broccoli, cabbage, and lettuce. So by planting these three, it can help address some of the insects that will attack broccoli, cabbage, and lettuce. Marigold has been recommended for zucchini. Basil and thyme have been recommended for tomato and for some of those tomato pests that you might be dealing with. The issue, as you look at this list though, recognize that marigold does tend to be a lover of the Japanese beetle population. So while you may be addressing, say, squash bugs for your zucchini by planting marigold, you may be also having Japanese beetle populations come in by planting marigold. So you may be addressing one insect, but you're not addressing others. There's a lot of other companion plants recommended out there. The ones I list for you here come from Iowa State through some of their research. You'll always find other ones that are recommended, and know that sometimes there's some anecdotal evidence behind some of them too. For some of those larger issues, you may find, such as commercial repellents for deer or rabbit or squirrels, groundhogs, and others, they just may not always work. It could be that they have to be applied a certain way. It could be that they have to be applied every time a rain event comes in and now it's removed. It could also be they're not listed for vegetable production. And so you need to apply these repellents in a certain area compared to the others. It's also crucial to think that the pest may become used to that smell. As much as you sometimes see recommendations of getting, hair clippings, any hair, you've had a haircut, you have all these leftover hair clippings, let's put them around the garden bed. Or what about blood meal? Or what about a very sweaty shirt that you have worked out in? What if you put that in the garden? It's a lot of anecdotal evidence, and you may find it just doesn't really work well for you because of that. I visited a home and garden center yesterday and kind of looked through some of what their repellents were that they had. You see this one here, that the main active ingredient is egg solids, it's garlic. So those are the main ingredients that are keeping this deer population, as well as it was listed for rabbit population, under control. You also see thyme oil. So it's acting as a repellent. This one, as I can look at, is not labeled for vegetables. So you would not be applying it on the vegetables itself. You might be applying it around the border of your area. But it needs to be moved around often, is where you're at with these repellents. As far as site selection, and we may be a little bit late when it comes to this, but you may be at a place where you could actually kind of change some things around, that site modification. Certainly avoiding areas where insects, mammals, and birds could increase in populations. If you have an area of native grasses, native plants, brush, wood areas, there can be some guidance as far as how far away your garden needs to be from this area to ensure that you're not having this population increase. You see a lot of guidance out there that will also say, try to maintain a very weed-free area around your bed. And the reason for this is that your insect pest population can increase in population pretty quickly if they're hanging out in some of these weed species. Another crucial step is removing any bird feeders, other feeding stations at night especially is good here. Not only would this be a bird situation, but also squirrels, ground squirrels, even some of those other mammals may be hanging out here and realize, oh, we're getting food from the bird feeder, and now look, there's a great vegetable garden for us, so thank you so much. So removal of those or moving them around could be a better step. Sometimes closer to your house could be better and easier for you. Occasionally creating a very high, tall raised bed can work. 6-7 inches tall can be really helpful when it comes to a rabbit population, as they tend to not like to jump up into those areas. Sometimes even keeping a raised bed in an area where the population can be extremely exposed, so that they're not having any ability to hide out, can be useful here. Planting near plants that could create a barrier. Sometimes you will see information that suggests certain plants that mammals and other ones don't tend to like. There's been some suggestion that sometimes the certain deer population don't tend to like a certain way that some of the vegetable plants feel against their skin and against their coats. Trying to keep the area between the garden, woodlands, and others maintained is really crucial. Pesticides is also another strategy that could be combined with a lot of your other strategies that you're doing. So while you may be using row cover, while you're insect scouting, while you are maybe doing some trap cropping, which we'll talk about, pesticides could be factored in here. The only thing to step back here is to recognize that you need to match up everything to assure it's applying to address the correct pest, the right time of the growth stage of the vegetable that you are growing, using any personal protective equipment, which you've heard a lot about the last 2 months, and ensuring that you're using the correct rate at the right time. So there can be a lot of good both insecticides as well as herbicides available to you when it comes to controlling them, but just know that it may not make the most sense for what you're after. A lot of times our home and garden centers will have a wide selection, but spend some time reading the label, doing your research, really thinking about if this can surely maybe address a problem. There's a lot of insects that need to come into contact with the pesticide. So it needs to be directly applied onto their skin in order for them to actually be killed, to be removed. We still recommend applying any of these early in the evening, especially when pollinators are not flying, even if your vegetables haven't reached a place where they have already pollinated and already flowered. You'll find a number of organic pesticides. You will see the label OMRI, O-M-R-I, which is here. These are things such as kaolin clay, BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, which is typically used for, say, cabbage worms. They digest it, they eat it. Neem oil is one that you'll see a lot of, and that one is typically applied onto different skin of, say, some of our brown marmorated stink bugs. There's horticultural oils. There's horticulture vinegar, which sometimes is recommended for use when it comes to weed control and so forth. You'll see 7, you'll see a lot of other ones out there. Just be very mindful of how they're applied, when they're applied, and recognize it's just kind of part of your overall vegetable pest management plan. For herbicides, you're going to find more options pre-planting. You will find some that are labeled and could be used for dealing with a weed population. You see things such as corn gluten meal, which Preen has a corn gluten meal option that's used for weeds that have not germinated yet. So that's the difficulty with it, is that if the weeds have already germinated and grown, corn gluten meal is only going to address those that have not germinated. Trifluralin is one that's used in Preen. This is one that is you're able to use in vegetable production. Recognize that not all vegetables can use this one. So I looked at the label of it yesterday because we had a question about it, and not every vegetable in the vegetable garden can utilize this one. There's also glyphosate, clove oil, horticultural vinegar. Some of these are very selective when it comes to the weed that they're going to kill. A lot of other ones out there are not. They're going to kind of kill everything. And we'll talk a bit more about this as we go along. Yet again, these are just a couple of examples of ones that are out there. I'll give you a resource as well. Traps sometimes work pretty well for our insect populations. So very common for insects like cucumber beetles, like squash bugs and others. They tend to be very attracted to a yellow color. So by putting out something that will attract them to that yellow color we're after can be really crucial here. We do not recommend trapping for Japanese beetles. They tend to attract way more Japanese beetles than you would have ever had in your population and on your property. If it is mammals and you're trying to trap them and remove them, know that you may need a permit. I don't know it as well as I should, but just recognize that you may need that if you're actually removing and trapping some of these mammals from you. With slugs in the vegetable garden, the beer trap or the yeast, it doesn't always tend to be as effective. That's what some research from California, Davis has shown. Board traps tend to be a little bit better, and that's where you kind of have this piece of wood that's laid down on top of the soil, and the slugs tend to kind of gravitate upwards towards it. But as far as your insect traps, a lot of these are kind of make your own, is what you really see here with that. And the bear traps might work well for you, as you see in this photo where you're digging a cup into the soil, you're putting beer into it, they're drowning, you're emptying it out. Maybe for a very small population that might work pretty well. Yeast is a mixture of yeast, sugar, water, and that creates kind of an attractant for the slugs and potentially some of your snails. So let's kind of profile a couple of these vegetable garden pests and get into some detail as far as what are some strategies that you could do, what are some recommendations, what are some things that they like, and potentially what do they typically avoid. For grasshoppers, this is going to be a very difficult pest to control. The recommendations out there are very limited when it comes to actually controlling the grasshopper population. The chewing will be done by nymphs, so those very young grasshoppers, as they are reproducing and growing. They tend to like lettuce, they tend to like beans, sweet corn, carrots, onions. You will typically find that they'll avoid the squash, peas, and tomatoes. So In looking at damage and seeing damage, you may find that you'll see it more on your lettuce and beans versus maybe on your squash and peas. Yet that typically is what you're after. Sometimes the strategies can be row cover, yet again, trap cropping with zinnias on the border. So planting zinnias around the border of your vegetable garden may attract the grasshoppers to the zinnias, and then from there you would need to control that population, either ham removal, insecticide, or something. Sometimes even just maintenance of the growing area can be pretty crucial here when it comes to keeping the grasshopper population under control. But you could have a breakout. You could have a large population that shows up, and you may have to take some really strategic steps when it comes to controlling. Brown marmorated stink bug is a bit more of a generalist insect too. So you saw a photo of it a couple of slides ago, and this is just more of a close-up of what this damage actually looks like. They tend to hide really well on the opposite side of where the fruit of, say, the tomato and pepper is developing. So they're not going to be facing outwards. They'll kind of be facing more into the actual tomato plant. They are an invasive species, and we're seeing a lot more damage of it more frequently. Damage will appear as kind of these small dots on the outside of the tomato because they have a piercing, sucking mouth part where they're putting their kind of long stylus and mouth into it. They tend to like sweet corn, beans, peppers, tomatoes is really what they're after. You will probably see them sometimes on your other fruits as well. And the damage is just kind of this appearance as you see here in this photo. A barrier would be a great consideration here. You could put a barrier such as the floating row cover around your plants, especially as maybe they have already germinated and they're producing for you. Some sources have suggested a handheld vacuum of vacuuming up the stink bugs could be a good solution here. There are some insecticides, including some that are organic and other ones, and maybe you reach a point of toleration. I would state also too that you may want to go ahead and pick your tomatoes at pink blush, just as they just start to color, instead of leaving them on the vine in which they could be attacked more and more. Slugs tend to like cool, moist areas with shade. Trying to have a vegetable garden that avoids those conditions could be quite helpful when it comes to addressing your slug population. We see increase in population during rainy seasons and very much in well-irrigated gardens. As we've experienced a lot of rainfall the last couple of weeks, and as we enter June and maybe experiencing more additional rainfall, you may have a slug issue. They tend to feed on leaves of many plants, especially some of the seedlings. They tend to also feed on ripening fruits and vegetables. And then you may also see it on decaying plant material. So any leaf tissue, anything that's kind of breaking down, you may find an outbreak of a slug population there. There are baits, there are pesticides. Yet again, always make sure that these are listed for the vegetables that you're growing and the vegetable production that you're planning for us to do. That's kind of what you're after here. Japanese beetles, these are ones that we get lots of questions about. And as someone who grew up in Tennessee, and we've had Japanese beetles since about 1991, it was very odd to me as I moved up to Northern Illinois, and it's a very newer beetle issue, if you will. They like one vegetable. They may like one vegetable compared to another. I've seen some fields where they gravitate towards one particular type versus hitting everything else. A lot of times there's a number of strategies. So the one recommendation usually is hand picking. Early in the morning, because they're just starting to wake up, they're still a little bit frazzled, shaking them into a soapy bucket of water and drowning them is a great strategy, which may work well for you. There are traps, but as mentioned, they always attract more than are really captured. And if you are in a very small area, growing area, it may not make much sense to you to have this trap with it. There are trap croppings, zinnias, marigolds, yet again, they tend to really like both of those. By planting them out in a certain area, maybe you could pull them over to that area and then address them from there. So it could be that maybe you're putting them on a further edge of your garden or your growing area further away from your vegetables. But you would still need to control them. You still may need to control them. And it could be an insecticide is utilized at this point or something with it. Chemical control options, there is neem oil, there is spinosyn, which are both organic ones. We get a lot of questions about what about the soil solutions, addressing the grubs as they are in the soil. There is fairly anecdotal evidence that this works. A lot of times the reason is that the Japanese beetles are such substantial flyers and they move around so well that addressing it in your backyard growing area isn't going to fully address the entire Japanese beetle population, because your neighbor may have a huge population that could just move in right next door to you. So it's not always cost effective when it comes to addressing them from a soil solution. I was in a call last week on strawberry production for Minnesota, and Minnesota Extension is recommending a handheld vacuum in the growing area. Sucking them up and then drowning them is what they're recommending. So that might be a great strategy. It will look really weird, I recognize, and yet that might be your best solution for it. But know that these are where our recommendations are at this point. Earwigs could also be another issue in the vegetable garden. A main target of vegetable seedlings is really what they're after, but can be an insect predator in the garden. So I think that that's where you have to balance it out. Because yes, it could be going after some of your vegetable seedlings, but the earwig could also be addressing some of those pest problems that you've yet to run into. We don't always see it as a significant problem. As such, a floating row cover for seedlings might be recommended. There's also trappings where you have an empty tuna can, about a ½ inch of vegetable oil, and then fill it up, and then they tend to be attracted and trapped there. A rolled up moistened newspaper in the evening can also be utilized. So roll it up tight. They should go into that rolled up newspaper, and then from there you could destroy it. Cabbage worms, so these are now more cabbage focused of the cole family. Very common on cabbage, broccoli, kale, lots of others. We see a lot of chewing damage that can be very severe on this group and on this family. The insects just hide very well in the leaves of the plants. They look like a very similar color. The other thing is that you may not see the actual worms just yet. You may actually see the adults flying everywhere, which are these beautiful white moths. So a lot of times you're in your garden and you think, oh, this is so beautiful. I love these moths. They're just kind of flying everywhere. And yet these are the adults and they're laying their eggs onto the actual cabbage plants. So it may be easier to first off try to control the white moths if you can. Floating row cover, a barrier, tends to be the best recommendation to start off. If I was to plant cabbage plants, I might actually go ahead and lay a row cover down in order to address it. Any removal of nearby weeds, kind of hand removal, might also be a good strategy. There are some pesticides such as BT, which is recommended, but because of the nooks and the crannies of your cabbage, of your broccoli, it can be very hard to utilize an insecticide because you're not always effectively getting to them. I would first try to use the row cover as my first step. I would also try to maybe just do some hand removal early on. You will also see the insect droppings, which are a bit more of that green color on the undersides of the leaves, and destroying them could also be quite crucial here too. Squash vine borer may appear in a couple of weeks. So this will be, as you've seen, wilted squash, kind of the sawdust frass on the stem. Damage is typically done by the adult laying eggs late June into July. So about a month from now is when you might expect to kind of see this and have an issue with it. Butternut squash, cucumbers, melons, these are usually not targeted. You may have some issues with it, but just kind of be mindful of that when it comes to this. You might also think about planting summer squash in early July. As much as we want to actually get our summer squash out there early, it may be best to actually wait an additional month and plant it later. A yellow pan or a pail and filling it with water could also help trap the adults and keep them from planting. So maybe you actually put out this yellow pan in a couple of weeks just before they start to show up. And then a row cover could also be crucial here, putting that in place of the plants on top of it before they start to flower, and then removing once it's flowered. You see the adult here, and then you see the nymph and the younger one on the right here. So a lot of times we don't always see the adults, but we actually see the damage. And then if you were to cut the actual stem of the plant, you would actually then see the actual damage of the juveniles. Squash bugs, they look a little bit similar to what you see here on the left. Nymphs, adults, they tend to really kind of scout and be in the flowers around the yellow. They're underneath any debris. They have lots of egg masses and juveniles within here, so they just tend to be kind of everywhere. They love to hide. And you will find that removing debris would be a great strategy during the growing season and after harvest. Trellising, getting up some of those squash plants above and off of the ground to keep them from hiding. Yet again, a row cover would also be useful here too, to keep the plants and acting as a barrier. Yellow sticky traps can sometimes work, having that yellow coloration. A trap cropping, such as a blue Hubbard squash, you plant that, it tends to attract more of them towards that. You still have to manage the blue Hubbard squash. Hand picking, removal of those egg masses underneath the leaves can be quite helpful for this as well. But as shared with you in the previous slide, a yellow pail of water might be your best strategy here, kind of combining them both to potentially address both insect problems. For cucumber beetle, this is one that you are going to see a lot hiding in the flowers. They're really attracted to these flowers, and they are both striped and they are also spotted. The concern we sometimes have with these beetles is that they will spread bacterial wilt in their mouth. So they will move from plant to plant and they will spread this disease. And that's where we get really kind of concerned with that. Crop rotation can sometimes help, being further away from previous squash plants. Floating row covers pre-bloom could also be useful. Sticky traps like yellow trap cropping would also work. And if I had a very severe, heavily infested blossom, I would probably remove that. The photo you see here on the top here with just covered in cucumber beetles, I would remove that. I would destroy them probably by drowning is what I might do. And potentially that could help with addressing that population. But they do fly, and that can be hard to manage. We had a question about flea beetles, and flea beetles we a lot of times see on eggplant, and yet they can still target a lot of other vegetables in your vegetable garden. We see a lot of heavy defoliation of leaves, so they just kind of create a very sheer pattern on the leaves. Sometimes the best strategy for this one could be a late planting. So while you may be planting your eggplant this week or the next week, maybe wait a couple more weeks and plant it just a little bit later. Like some of our other insect pests, exclusion through a row cover could be quite crucial. There's also been some suggestion of a trap crop of radishes. So putting radishes around the perimeter of your maybe growing area, if you've had significant problems, could help address your flea beetles. You would still have to manage the flea beetles once they're targeting the radishes, but this could be an option. Sometimes they're attracted natural predators who will have control over the populations. You may also find some insecticides. I typically see row cover as a good option for eggplant. You will, of course, have to remove it once it has started to flower, yet the severity of flea beetle damage may not be as severe based on having some kind of row cover in place to keep them from really targeting them. For tomato and pepper insects, aphids, whiteflies, these are your smaller insects. They may also be on other vegetables in your garden. Know that really we don't see too much of an issue with both of these. Aphids will show up typically late spring into summer. A large number of the aphids can cause curling, stunting, just wilting of the leaves. And you may find the solution is just a removal of that leaf tissue. Whiteflies, mid to late summer is what you'll see here, but the population really isn't sufficient to cause much damage, and leaf removal could be a strategy. For both of these, you will find that natural predators may be doing their thing. Population of lady beetles may be controlling them. along with other insect predators in your garden. So it may not be too much cause of concern. Yet if there was a bit of severity here, you might decide to remove the leaves that are severely impacted and covered with these populations. Your bigger guys for tomatoes and peppers, hornworm is the top one you see here, fruitworm is the bottom one. Large defoliation, just leaves are just completely removed off the plant. You see lots of fruit damage. You may also find early ripening of fruit in the fruitworm especially. You might look and see, oh, here's my first red tomato. You pick the red tomato, you turn it over, and that's where you actually have fruitworm damage, which is what you see here in this bottom photo. I picked this tomato thinking I had my first one about to change color, a pink blush. I turned it over and there was fruitworm. Because fruitworm tends to go into the actual fruit of the tomatoes and peppers, it's very hard to control when it comes to something like insecticides. A lot of times hand picking tends to be the best strategy, especially for something like hornworm or fruitworm. They both are just easy sometimes to hand pick, especially the hornworm. Egg sac removal would also be crucial, so scouting in your vegetable garden, looking for things on the leaf tissue. Some insecticides could be useful, but yet again, the fruitworm is already inside the actual fruit as it's developing, so it may not do you much good, and removal of any nearby weeds that could be building up a population for them. So we're moving now into mammals. So that was kind of a brief introduction to insect pests. I know there's a lot of other ones out there, but as of today, just wanted to kind of highlight a couple of things. So for raccoons, a lot of times the damage is on sweet corn. That's where you're going to see a lot of it from a vegetable garden perspective. Strawberries, peas, potatoes, melons, even lawn grubs could also have raccoon damage and raccoon populations. In most cases, the repellents and the scare tactics do not tend to work. You will see those listed a lot as far as strategies and solutions, and they don't tend to be the best. They just don't tend to work too well. Exclusion tends to be the most effective, and you may find with sweet corn that you need to have a certain type of fence in place or some kind of netting or something to keep them out of there. You also want to think about how the backyard garden is set up and how it looks, especially if you have any dogs or animals that are outside. Making sure that food, water, pet bowls at the end of the day are brought back in can ensure that your population doesn't reach where it needs to be. You also might consider being closer to the house, kind of away from those wooded areas. Fencing before planting about 5 and 10 inches, and it does need to be electric in this situation. There's also sometimes a recommendation for a taller sweet corn variety. Silver Queen, candy corn are both taller crops that could potentially address the raccoon population with it. So there can be some strategies, and a lot of times it's exclusion. It's also kind of remediating kind of what's happening in the backyard. For rabbits, you're going to see damage on most vegetables, although they usually ignore corn, squash, cucumbers, tomatoes, and potatoes. You may see that they have damage on some of those that they would ignore early on in the season. So before they've actually started to actually get bigger and grow, that might be where it happens. One recommendation has been to remove any tall grass areas, especially if a population could be building up and reproducing. Look towards exclusion as another strategy. A low fence of 2-foot chicken wire with about 1 inch or smaller mesh tight, or it needs to really be buried 3 to 6 inches deep into the soil with this. You may find that some scare tactics may work for a bit, but it may not be the best solution here. They may get very much used to it. Anecdotally, sometimes we do see people with greater success in a raised bed because of the height of it. Sometimes rabbit populations tend to not go higher up to that, but it does depend. In Joe Davis County, we have a lot of issues with deer populations, especially from a vegetable backyard garden perspective. The damage from them tends to be that the plants are torn, they're really not clean cut. Rabbit damage is more clean cut. That's really what you'll find. Whereas plants that are torn, that's typically what a deer damage would more look like. You may see tooth marks in the fruit, you may see deer tracks. Deer love hostas, they also love tulips. looking at both of those right now before you've planted vegetables might give you an idea if you are going to be dealing with a deer population that season. They do have a number of vegetables that they love. These are beans, beets, the cabbage, cole family, peas, spinach, sweet corn, sweet potatoes. They tend to like those a little bit more than some of the others. They rarely damage onions, rhubarb, peppers, tomatoes, garlic, cucumbers. There's a number of herbs that they will also tend to gravitate more towards. Yet again, depends on the season, depends on what's growing nearby. They may decide that this year they're going to start eating tomatoes. It's just very hard to tell you too much when it comes to some of the wildlife issues. So strategies, repellents may work for a brief period of time. We do want to make sure that those are labeled for vegetable use, or you may find that that repellent needs to be placed on the border of your garden area. Yet again, look more into that if you're going down that route. The fence needs to be at least 7 to 8 feet tall. And you also have to have some kind of marker that is visible to the deer. They have found a lot of research shows that electric fence doesn't tend to work too well for a deer population. So you could get away with a typical fence, ensuring it's 7 to 8 feet tall. There's a lot of designs out there. They also tend to crawl under a standard plastic mesh fence, so you may not find much success there. From Minnesota, they have been doing a number of research on micro enclosures, and looking at some of their work with wildlife biologists, they have found that fencing certain parts of your growing area much smaller could actually deter the deer, as they tend to not want to go into smaller areas. So there is some research around this, and I'll send a link to you as well. As far as a solution for deer control or deer population on a much more cost-effective point of view, this would be 16 by 16 foot using cattle panels as well as hardware. And you may even want to go smaller, but you would want it more exposed is what you're after here. But yeah, this is some interesting research. I haven't seen this suggestion before, and yet this may help when it comes to your vegetable garden, having this panel in place. Of course, as you look at this could address deer populations. It's obviously not going to address some of your other mammal issues. So that's the challenge you run into, is that it may address one thing, but it may expose you. You may run into other issues the other time. Skunks and opossums neither tend to be major problems in the vegetable garden. You may see some digging for grubs in the soil. Like raccoons, try to keep pet food from being left out. Make sure you're securing the garbage can lids. Any kind of rotting vegetables could also be attracted to them. So being mindful of what your compost bin looks like and how it's being stored. Making sure we're removing any brush pile could also help here too. And then keeping vegetable garden away from brush areas. Like I share with you, they're mainly going after the grubs in the soil. They're going after some of those other things, but it could depend on the season. It could also depend on the population in your backyard, whether this is an issue with your skunks and opossums. We got a lot of questions about chipmunks and squirrels, and as I shared with you, I'm dealing with this as well. Both of these groups, they tend to go towards tomatoes, strawberries, any sprouting seeds, squash. I've had a number of them remove all of the onion bulbs I have planted in a row. The squirrels have, because I apparently put them in the wrong place. We see injury a little bit less to, say, the leafy vegetables less frequently. Netting and having a barrier tends to be the best recommendation here. You could try to get away with some fencing, at least 30 inches high, 5 inches below ground, and then the fencing has to be at least bent outward 90 degrees. And this could be the same fencing that maybe could help you with rabbit control as well. You might also look toward any small domes or cages of defined mesh, and it'd have to be at least half an inch small or not. The other thing to look at is removal of bird feeders. Because this population is increasing underneath those bird feeders and being fed, you may find that they are building up and they're ready to move into your vegetable garden. Right now on either side of where I live, I have neighbors who are using bird feeders, anecdotally right now it seems like I just have a couple little squirrel issues, but not as much as I could. Some folks have also recommended targeted feeding areas, that they are tolerating the squirrels, the ground squirrels, as well as the chipmunks, and they are just feeding them in certain areas of their growing area and hoping that that could potentially address them from moving into their vegetable garden. But it depends on where they're at and what their likes are. Netting, fencing, any kind of barrier is going to be your best solution here. Voles or meadow mice, they have a wide range of vegetables and fruits and trees and plants. They will also see kind of creating those burrows and openings at the soil surface. And these are about a 1/2 inch to 2 inches in diameter. Some of the strategies for this group is removal of weeds. Very heavy mulch can also help kind of keep them from being a problem. Trying to have some exclusion, a wire fence. This has to be 12 inches above ground, buried about 6 to 10 inches deep, and a 1/4 inch or smaller. So if you're trying to keep out voles, chipmunks and squirrels and rabbits, you might be able to just do one fence as long as it's tall enough, goes deep enough into the soil, and making sure that that is at least a 1/4 inch or smaller. For birds, it's more common damage on the fruit. So it is that blackberries, raspberries, blueberries, and strawberries, we tend to see more damage on it. But in sweet corn, we may see it from blackbirds as well as others. It really depends on that bird population in the backyard and kind of what's going on there. You may find that scare devices could work for a little bit of time, but they're not going to work for that full time. Folks have suggested before these scare devices, which is what you see here, hanging up and moving around some of those plastic predators. You have seen recommendations before of CDs that are hanging up in the wind, or silver, things like that maybe could help. And yet they all tend to not work too well. They work for just a small amount of time. Netting would be the easiest thing. Having some netting in place could help address it. There are chemical repellents, grape Kool-Aid deterrent, which could be applied on some of your crops that you might be growing. This is one where you're taking about 3 to 4 packets of unsweetened grape Kool-Aid, and you're mixing it with a quart of water, and you're putting it on your vegetables and fruit as it's ripening. And it's acting as a bittering agent. So they don't tend to like that. That would work, I think, okay for some of your fruits. It may be a little bit more difficult with sweet corn, for instance, where that's not going to work too well because they'll get to it whether or not it's a bittering agent. You've seen some probably where they'll recommend hot pepper oil. That's not recommended anymore. The birds don't have the actual taste buds to be able to actually realize that it's a very hot pepper kind of solution to it. Consider site selection, really thinking about how your garden is set up. If there are areas that would allow for a bird population to build up and hang out, could be a problem with it when it comes to that site selection. For weed management, I find proper ideas is really crucial to determine your strategies. As much as it's very sometimes we have great ideas as far as managing insects, mammals, and birds in that vegetable garden, it can be a little bit more difficult with the weed problem. And it's very important to recognize what you're dealing with. If it's an annual or perennial weed that's going to come back season after season, how is it spreading? You may also find that once you have actually ID'd it, you do not want to put it in the compost because it could just regenerate and go right back out into your field. You may find it could just not be the right strategy. If you find that weed management has really escaped you, especially later on in this growing season, try to remove the weed seed head as much as you can and destroy them. That may not work for every single weed, especially as to how it moves, but it could be a strategy that you use. The photo you see here is Pennsylvania smartweed, and it is a weed that I have battled numerous times when it comes to certain areas that I've been growing in. The issue with Pennsylvania smartweed is that it thrives under mulch. So as much as we would recommend for weed control, try to put down straw mulch or leaf mulch or something, I cannot do that for Pennsylvania smartweed because it just loves this mulch growing area. I actually need to do another strategy of hand pulling and potentially an herbicide for what I might be doing. Recognize if you are going the route of herbicides that some are labeled for vegetable gardens and some are not. And as I shared with you, some are labeled for specific vegetables and some are not labeled for other ones. The strategies then can be mulching, could be a lot of hand pulling, it can be herbicides, it can just be being very mindful of what your weed populations look like. And a lot of times we would highly rely more on the mulching process and putting a mulch layer in place. It could be if you're starting a new vegetable garden to actually lay down a layer of cardboard or newspaper or something to have that barrier in place, and maybe that could help you when it comes to it. We've done some of that in our Rockford office garden too, where we have actually put down a wet cardboard and then we've laid a mulch on top to hopefully address weed control. So I'm beginning to wrap up. I can kind of see there's a lot of questions in the chat box, which is great. These are a number of resources. I'll send you an email today that will link you to every single one listed here. But just want to mention a couple of them. Garden Insects in North America by Whitney Cranshaw, a very good resource when it comes to identifying insects in your growing area. Highly recommend having that on your bookshelf because it does help you figure out what the best strategies are and what do these insect populations really look like. The resource for companion planting with the ones I shared with you today from Reiselman from Iowa State is listed there. She also has an overview on trap cropping, and I've shared that a little bit today. Trap cropping, where you're putting a crop out that a certain insect pest or a mammal likes more than the rest, and so you're kind of sacrificing that crop for the good of the rest of your crop. And she goes into some information as far as how to get that set up. I can share with you that I just planted blue Hubbard squash last week. So my plan is to actually get my blue Hubbard squash germinated and growing as a sacrificial crop for cucumber beetles, and hopefully keep that from being a problem with my other squash that I'm growing. There's a good resource on common herbicides for fruit and vegetable weed control. Get an early start on vegetable garden weed control from Michigan State University. The grape Kool-Aid recommendation, as well as the guidance, is in this Bye Bye Birdies bird management strategies from Cornell. So you'll have that link. You can kind of see what the basics of that are. Protecting plants from deer from Minnesota goes more into that deer fence. Two resources and additional videos to share with you are from Dave Shiley from University of Illinois Extension. He recently retired, yet he presented 2 presentations in the last couple of years on wildlife damage control and managing it. So some of the recommendations you see today come from both of these videos, and I will have links to them that get into some of the more of the basic information out there that, as someone who's not a wildlife biologist, I just don't know. Just want to mention briefly, we have a number of blogs that are still active, still very much going. Raise, Grow, Harvest, Eat, Repeat is a blog myself and Bruce Black contribute to. He recently put an article on pine berries, kind of a pineapple flavored strawberry that you can grow in the backyard in Northern Illinois. We also still have a very good active blog on good growing, kind of those basics of it. And then Flowers, Fruits, and Frass from Central Illinois has some good information too. There's a number of upcoming webinars as well. Planting cover crops for the backyard garden is coming up on May 26th at 10 a.m. May 27th at 3 p.m. is mulching options for gardens. This is a good growing online webinar that goes into more detail. We also have an additional webinar on June 11th called What's in My Backyard? Weed Identification. So 3 webinars that really hit some highlights when it comes to pest management perspectives and what you should do and consider doing. So we're wrapping up today. Be on the lookout now. Start making observations to see what issues you might be running into, especially as you get your vegetable garden set up and growing. I have just planted cool season the last couple of weeks and have started to observe things. A number of my warm season crops will be going out this weekend, and so I will be expecting to be doing some similar management. Think about your pests, think about that damage, and any potential vulnerabilities they may have, especially exposure that they may have at this time. Try to focus on site selection and exclusion if you can, and look to use many different strategies. I hope that's what you've gotten out of today, is that it's just not one thing to address it. It's going to be a lot of different things that comes with it. Next week, we're getting into container vegetable gardening. So you will find a link to that to register on our website. I can also send that out in our email too for you to have that. So I'm going to go through the chat box of any additional questions we've got. This is my phone number. You can reach me at. You can also email me as well with any additional questions you have. We do have a Facebook that we have are pretty active on and try to update with different resources, webinars, and other information out there. I will send you a link to today's evaluation, but you also can take a photo using your smartphone here, and that will go directly to our evaluation. As this is kind of one of the first kind of overviews on pest management, I'm sure there's a number of things I've left out and probably need to be included. And there's a place on that evaluation to list a couple of things that you feel might need to be there. So with that, I'm going to look at my chat box and answer some questions. So Andy is the first one to ask a question. What chewing insects are active now? We're still in a place where we're not seeing too many just yet, Andy. I think as this weather begins to warm the next week or two, we're probably going to see some populations start to increase. And so I would be kind of on the lookout for some of those first wave of cabbage worms and other ones that will move in. I would start to maybe do some insect scouting next week on the leaves and potentially look for some of those egg droppings of the cabbage worms and some of the other ones. You may also have found, there could be some other insects out there right now, but I don't think we're there just yet. I'd give it one or more towards week for that one. Question, do you foresee an abundance of insects this growing season based on our mild winters? We tend to see that, AJ, is that we see more insect populations due to a more mild winter. Years ago, when we did have that very rough winter, it didn't tend to really impact our insect populations whatsoever. Now, the thing that's going to throw them off is going to depend highly on, just what this a little bit colder lingering effects of our spring have been, that I think we could see some issues with that population. But depending on what you saw last year and the previous year, I would expect that things are going to be pretty normal when it comes to it. Question, do blueberries need to be pollinated? They do need to be pollinated. So you're going to find that while you could put that netting on there, you need to ensure that you're getting your pollinators to your blueberries. So you may be able to kind of safeguard your blueberries for a little bit of time, but once they start to flower, you do want to remove that so that they can be pollinated by your pollinators. Question, I had an 8-foot fence erected around my garden. Last year was my first season for vegetables with the fence. The problem, however, is burying animals. At the end of last season, I had small holes over my garden. Luckily, they didn't bother much, but some at the height of harvest. Should I dig up my whole garden and line it with something which would be a big job, or what? Research indicates that these animals can bury down about 3 feet. I have some seedlings of a plant called Gopher spurge that I hope will deter chipmunks, and I'm going to do the Irish spring thing and also other fragrant plants. So what could be done here? Because you already have a fence in place, I would look maybe towards some of those deterrents if you could. Because you put so much effort and so much work into it, you might try to look towards that. Some of the recommendations I kind of shared with you as far as the chipmunks, you may then find that, if they're going underneath that fence, maybe you actually need to put some netting on top of those plants if they're getting to them. So that would be my strategy. You've already got the fence in place. Now go into that garden area and see if you could put some additional netting or something in place of it. Chipmunks and the squirrels do dig lower depth root, and I just don't think it might be cost effective at this point to try to dig much further, especially this 3 feet down. So I might try to look towards more of a netting inside that garden, which would be a little bit more cost effective from that. I hope that kind of answered your question, but we can talk a little bit more if you want to email me as well. Okay, so Deb did a follow-up. Would it make sense to put a type of chicken wire basket under plants like tomatoes or to deter chipmunks. I'd let it stick out of the ground as well to tear them from the roots. Yes, that's what I would suggest, Deb, is that for some of those plants that they're going to go towards, that might be where you do an additional chicken wire basket under the plants, or just kind of some kind of netting to help with. So yeah, that I think we're on the same page there, is that have the fence in place, but now go inside and actually keep some additional barriers. Denise, question, what insects would the earwig be a predator of? So they're going after some smaller insects is what we're finding with them. The issue though is that the earwig is not necessarily going for some of the vegetable garden pests, if you will. They might be going for some of the aphids and for some of the smaller ones, but they're not going to be going towards, you know, some of the main vegetable garden pests with it. So they're kind of more of a generalist is what I understand when it comes to the earwig. So yes, if you had a large outbreak earwig population, you might want to control it. If you had a couple in there, I don't know if I would worry too much about it because they could be addressing some of the insect issues. Question, when you vacuum, do they die, the Japanese beetles? As much as I can understand it, they are not dying. So I think you still need to empty that container into some soapy bucket of water and drown them further. Andy followed up and shared his stink bugs are still alive in the vacuum months later. Yeah, I think they're doing it. Jerry shares the picture was a white butterfly, white moth, and more grace. Oh, whoops! Sorry about that. You're correct, Jerry. I will change that. I appreciate that. I'm not the best when it comes to IDing those. Question: do you need to add anything else to the water in yellow pan? You really don't. You know what they really suggest is that water, the yellow color, and the water pan should drown them effectively. So there's nothing else that additionally needs to be added in there. You may have to submerge them a little bit more though, I think, and you may also want to change it out pretty regularly. But as far as any other ingredient that needs to be added in there, it is not needed. Question, does hornworm cause fruit damage? It does. The hornworm will defoliate the plants. It will also go towards the actual fruits as it's developing. So that would be where you see both signs of damage, from the leaf tissue as well as on the actual fruit itself. You will see the fruit worm, as you saw in that photo, it kind of has more, the fruit worm will tend to get more into the actual fruit itself and cause the plant to kind of ripen or show symptoms that it's ripening. The hornworm will actually kind of take out big chunks, almost as if it was eating an apple, if you will, and kind of move on and leave it behind. You'll also see a lot of hornworm droppings pretty much in that, on that plant too. Question, fencing for a rabbit should be some type of wire or metal. A baby rabbit chewed through my plastic fence 1 year and was around inside. He couldn't figure out how to get out. Yep, that's what I'm kind of thinking too, is that needs to have more of a metal fencing for it, where chicken wire might be a pretty good solution and strategy for that. Question, just put Kool-Aid solution on the plant. Yes, so putting it on the plant can be pretty good there. You know, applying it will act as that kind of bittering agent. They're going after the fruit itself, so you may not need the full plant to be covered. It wouldn't hurt you necessarily, but just know that that grape Kool-Aid is kind of acting as a bittering agent. So the grape Kool-Aid is not killing the birds, it's acting as a bittering agent to them. Question, I am overrun with roly-poly bugs, especially on my pots. Are they a problem? I also have ants everywhere. Should I just ignore them? So yeah, I mean, with both of those, they seem to not be too big of a problem, especially in your pots. I wouldn't worry too much about them. I would be more concerned with some of the other ones that might damage it. The only thing you might find is that they could be attracting maybe other insects or other pests that might be going after them. The same with ants. I wouldn't worry too much about the ants. The only thing that you may run into with ants is that depending on how big of a seed that you have planted in the garden, especially if it was direct seeded, you may find the ants are moving in and removing some of those seeds. That's at least what I have seen myself. Otherwise, I wouldn't worry too much about your ants at this stage. Question, have you seen some success using repel all on garden perimeters to keep ground squirrels out? Um, there has been some success with that. The issue is that the repellents may or may not work well for you. I think if you're looking at your strategy list and you have created a netting, you have addressed it with a wire fencing, you have done a couple of things to really keep them from being a problem, you might decide to use the repel all around the perimeter. But just recognize that some of these repellents, especially for wildlife, may not work too well. And there could be just some other strategies that are more exclusionary that could help with that. Should I be concerned about millipedes in my soil? I wouldn't worry too much about millipedes. We don't tend to see them be too much of a problem when it comes to kind of our vegetable garden pests. So you will see them occasionally, but I wouldn't worry too much about them. Some of the other ones we see more issues with. I missed a question. Deb asked, what are roly-poly bugs? Yeah, so Deb, you'll probably see that a lot with your containers. Sometimes you'll lift up the container and all the roly-poly bugs will be underneath that container because they're really kind of thriving in kind of the kind of darker areas, more shaded areas too. You can find, if you Google it, you will find lots of photos of what these look like. They tend to kind of scrounge up in a circle as well when they're kind of annoyed. Any additional questions? All right. Andy asks, what mammal would cut a pole bean vine when the vine is about 5 to 6 feet high? Cut is about 4 to 6 inches above ground. If the vine was removed, it's probably not deer, because deer would probably trample parts of your garden and kind of pull it through the rest of your garden. It doesn't sound to me like it's either going to be the vine is still there, you said. So the vine is still there. I'm not liable to think it's a deer issue. I'm not liable to think it's a rabbit issue either. Andy, send me some photos of what that looks like, and I can kind of play around and think a little bit more about that. Because when it comes to some of that wildlife, and I think we just are either thinking deer or rabbit, because I don't think we're going to have anything like a raccoon or some of the other mammals, but I don't know yet. So yeah, if you don't mind, kind of send me some photos of what that looked like, and we can kind of go from there. Yeah, maybe it's a chipmunk or another one too, if they can do some climbing, because yeah, that's what I understand as well. But yeah, send me some photos, Andy, and we can go from there. All right, well, thanks for joining us today. I've got 11:30. If you have additional questions today, please, feel free to email me and I can talk a little bit more, as well as phone calls. We can do that and send any photos you have. Next week, we'll have an additional webinar and have a very good Memorial Day weekend. And yeah, get out there and plant some stuff. It looks like a pretty good weekend to plant some vegetables if we don't get as much rain. All right, take care. Bye.